The morning sun shined brightly over New Seoul megalopolis. The clean streets were busy with people going to work. Flying cars moved smoothly between tall buildings that touched the clouds. On the ground level, Mrs. Sun Kim walked slowly along the street. She was 73 years old, but she walked with grace. Her gray hair was neatly tied back, and she wore simple but clean clothes. Mrs. Kim was going to her weekly meeting at the community center for elderly citizens. She touched the small device behind her ear. This was her neural audio implant. She had gotten it 5 years ago when she lost her hearing. The device helped her hear everything clearly, just like normal ears. The streets were extra busy today. The police were doing routine checks. They were looking for illegal technology from Mars. There had been problems with dangerous devices being sold on the streets lately. Officer Lee Ta stood at his checkpoint, watching people walk by. He had come from Mars only 6 months ago. Everything on Earth was different from what he knew. The gravity felt too strong, and there were so many old people everywhere. On Mars, most people were young and strong. Mrs. Kim approached the checkpoint. She smiled at the officer and started to take out her ID card. Officer Tae's eyes fixed on the device behind her ear. It was shiny and new-looking. It was different from the usual hearing aids he had seen in his training. "Stop right there," Officer Ta said loudly. His voice was harsh. "What is that device?" Mrs. Kim looked confused. She spoke clearly. "This is my neural audio implant, officer. I have all the proper papers for it." But Officer Ta wasn't listening. On Mars, criminals often hid dangerous tech in innocent-looking devices. He reached for the implant. "Hand it over now." "Please, officer," Mrs. Kim said calmly. She tried to explain in both Korean and English. "This is a medical device. I need it to hear. I can show you my medical card." Officer Ta didn't wait. He grabbed the device and pulled it from behind her ear. Mrs. Kim gasped in pain. The world went silent around her. She touched the sore spot where the implant had been. People around them stopped to watch. Some took out their phones to record what was happening. A young woman stepped forward to help Mrs. Kim, but Officer Ta waved her away. "This is police business," he said. He looked at the device in his hand. It was sleek and expensive looking. "This is definitely illegal tech. These kinds of advanced devices are not allowed on Earth." Mrs. Kim stood straight and tall. Even without her hearing, she kept her dignity. She pulled out her ID card and medical papers. Her hands didn't shake at all. She held them out to Officer Ta. Officer Ta took the papers. His eyes went wide as he read them. The implant was not only legal, but it was also made by one of Earth's top medical companies. Mrs. Kim had all the right papers for it. But before he could say anything, his radio buzzed. Captain Park Ji's voice came through, sounding worried. "Officer Ta, return the device immediately." "Do you know who she is?" Officer Ta looked at Mrs. Kim again. She stood quietly, waiting. She looked like any other elderly woman, but there was something about the way she held herself, something that spoke of importance and respect. He didn't know it yet, but his next shift would be very different. In the mayor's office across the city, a phone was already ringing, and the person answering it was not going to be happy about what had happened to his mother. Captain Park Ji sat at his desk in the police station. His morning had been quiet until now. He was drinking his coffee when his computer screen flashed red. An urgent message from City Hall appeared. As he read it, he nearly spilled his coffee. The message was short. Incident reported at Checkpoint 7. Elderly woman's medical device removed. Subject identified as Mrs. Sun Kim, mother of Mayor Kim Han. Immediate action required. Captain Park's hands shook as he reached for his radio. He knew Mayor Kim Han well. The mayor was a fair man, but he was also very protective of his family. The captain had seen how angry the mayor could get when someone hurt innocent people. And now, one of his officers had hurt the mayor's mother. "Officer Tae," he spoke into the radio, trying to keep his voice calm. "Return the device immediately. Do you know who she is?" While waiting for a response, Captain Park opened another screen. The street camera showed him everything that had happened. He watched Officer Todd pull the device from Mrs. Kim's ear. He saw how calm she remained, even when she was hurt. The captain shook his head. This was very bad. His office door opened. Lieutenant Yunde rushed in, looking worried. "Captain, have you seen the news? The videos are already online. People are very angry." Captain Park nodded. He looked at his computer again. More messages were coming in. News reporters wanted statements. City Hall wanted answers. And somewhere in the city, Mayor Kim Han was about to find out what had happened to his mother. In the mayor's office, Kim Han was in a meeting about the city's new transportation system. His secretary, Mr. Ba, ran into the room. Everyone stopped talking and looked up. "Mr. Mayor," Mr. Ba said, breathing hard, "there's been an incident. It's about your mother." Mayor Kim stood up quickly. "What happened to my mother?" His voice was quiet, but everyone in the room could feel his worry. Mr. Ba handed him a tablet. The mayor watched the video. His face didn't change, but his hands gripped the tablet tightly. The room was very quiet. After watching, Mayor Kim put the tablet down carefully. He looked at the people in the meeting. "I apologize, but we need to continue this later." His voice was still calm, but different now. It was the voice he used when he had to fix big problems. Back at the checkpoint, Officer Tai was starting to understand how much trouble he was in. His radio was full of urgent messages. His captain wanted him back at the station right away. Other officers were coming to take his place at the checkpoint. Mrs. Kim still stood there, waiting patiently. A medical team had arrived to check on her. They'd brought a temporary hearing device so she could hear again. When she could hear, she spoke softly to Officer Ta. "Young man," she said, "you have much to learn about Earth, but don't worry too much. My son is a good person. He will make sure this becomes a lesson for everyone, not just you." Officer Ta felt confused. "Your son?" he asked. One of the medical workers whispered to him, "Her son is Mayor Kim Han." Officer Ta felt his legs go weak. He had just hurt the mayor's mother. On Mars, such a mistake would end his career. He looked at Mrs. Kim again, but she was already walking away with the medical team. In the distance, sirens were getting closer. The morning sun now felt too bright, and Officer Todd wondered if he would ever work as a police officer again. The news spread quickly through New Seoul megalopolis. By afternoon, everyone had seen the video of Officer Tad removing Mrs. Kim's hearing device. The city's main news channels showed the video again and again. They focused on how Mrs. Kim stayed calm and dignified, even when she was hurt. People watched as Mrs. Kim tried 3 times to explain about her device. The video showed her speaking clearly in Korean, then in English. The security cameras had caught everything. They showed how Officer Todd didn't listen and didn't check her papers first. Many people were angry about this. At the Golden Years Community Center, where Mrs. Kim usually spent her mornings, the elderly members gathered to talk about what happened. Most of them also had medical devices, hearing aids, neural implants, and other technology that helped them live normal lives. "It could have been any of us," said Mr. Choi, an 80-year-old man with a heart monitor implant. "We all depend on our devices. The police need to understand this." Mrs. Park, who ran the community center, agreed. Mrs. Kim has always been kind to everyone. Even today, after what happened, she called to say she was sorry she missed the morning meeting. That's the kind of person she is. At the police station, things were very busy. Captain Park Ji had to answer many calls. News reporters wanted to know what would happen to Officer Ta. City officials wanted to know how the police would prevent similar problems in the future. The captain looked through Officer Ta's files. He found that the young officer had only received basic training about Earth's elderly population. On Mars, where Officer Ta came from, most people were young. They didn't use as many medical devices. This was no excuse for his behavior, but it helped explain his mistake. Social media was full of discussions about the incident. Many people shared their own stories about problems with the police. Others defended the police but said they needed better training. The video had started an important conversation about how society treated its elderly citizens. In one popular video, a medical technology expert explained how Mrs. Kim's neural audio implant worked. "This is not illegal technology," she said. "This is a normal medical device that many elderly people use. It helps them hear and stay connected with their families and friends. Taking it away is like taking away someone's glasses or wheelchair." By evening, protests formed outside the police station. The protesters were peaceful, but their message was clear. They held signs that read, "Respect our elders," and "Medical devices are not crimes." Many of the protesters were elderly people and their families. At the mayor's office, Kim Han's team worked hard to handle the situation. They received thousands of messages from citizens. Some people wanted Officer Ta to lose his job. Others suggested using this incident to make positive changes in the police force. Through all of this, Mrs. Kim remained calm at home. Her regular doctor had fixed her neural implant, and she could hear again. When reporters called to ask for interviews, she politely declined. She told her son's secretary, "This should not be about me. This should be about making things better for everyone." As the sun set over New Seoul megalopolis, the city buzzed with discussions about respect, understanding, and change. The incident had revealed problems that needed fixing. And tomorrow, Mayor Kim Han would need to decide how to address these problems, not just as a city leader, but as a son who had seen his mother mistreated. Mayor Kim Han arrived at his office early the next morning. He had spent a long time thinking about how to handle this situation. His assistant, Mr. Ba, waited with a report about everything that had happened yesterday. The mayor read the report carefully. There were messages from police officials, community leaders, and many citizens. Some people wanted Officer Ta to be dismissed immediately. Others suggested using this incident to improve police training. Mayor Kim considered all these views seriously. Before making any decisions, Mayor Kim visited his mother. Mrs. Sun Kim was at home, working in her small garden. Her neural implant was working properly again. She looked peaceful as she tended to her flowers. "Mother," Mayor Kim said, sitting beside her, "the city council wants to know what action I will take about yesterday's incident." Mrs. Kim looked at her son with wise eyes. "What does your heart tell you to do?" she asked. Mayor Kim thought about his mother's question. As a son, he felt angry about what had happened. But as a mayor, he needed to think about what would be best for everyone in the city. The easy path would be to dismiss Officer Ta. Mayor Kim said. Many people would be happy with that decision, but it would not solve the bigger problem. His mother nodded. She had always taught him to look for solutions that helped everyone. "The young officer made a mistake," she said, "but he is not the only one who needs to learn. Many people don't understand what life is like for elderly citizens." Mayor Kim returned to his office with a clear plan. He called a meeting with his advisors, the police chief, and community leaders. The meeting room was tense when everyone arrived. Yesterday's incident was unacceptable. Mayor Kim began. His voice was firm but calm. "However, we have an opportunity here. We can use this moment to make real changes in how our police force interacts with elderly citizens." He presented his plan. First, Officer Todd would not be dismissed. Instead, he would work with elderly community members to learn about their needs. Second, all police officers would receive new training about medical devices and elderly care. Third, the city would start a program to help Mars-born citizens better understand Earth's culture. Some people in the room looked surprised. They had expected the mayor to be angry and demand harsh punishment. Instead, he was suggesting changes that could help everyone. "My mother taught me that good leaders turn problems into opportunities," Mayor Kim explained. "We can either punish one officer, or we can fix the system that led to his mistake." The police chief spoke up. "But sir, many citizens are angry. They want to see immediate action." Mayor Kim stood up and walked to the window. He could see the city stretching out before him. "The easiest response is not always the best one," he said. "Our city is growing. More people are coming from Mars and other colonies. We need to learn how to live together with understanding and respect." By the end of the meeting, everyone agreed to support the mayor's plan. News reporters waited outside for the announcement. Mayor Kim would tell them about his decision, knowing that some people might disagree. But he believed that this was the right path forward. As he prepared to face the media, Mayor Kim thought about his mother working in her garden. She had shown dignity and wisdom even when she was treated unfairly. Now he would try to show the same wisdom in solving this problem. 1 week after the incident, Mayor Kim Han launched the Respect and Recognition program at New Seoul Police Headquarters. The large meeting room was full of police officers, community leaders, and reporters. Officer Lee Ta sat in the front row, looking nervous but determined. Mayor Kim stood at the podium and addressed the crowd. "Today we begin a new chapter in our city's history," he said. "Our goal is to build bridges between all citizens of New Seoul, whether they were born on Earth or Mars." The program started with a simple but powerful demonstration. Several elderly citizens showed their medical devices to the police officers. They explained how these devices helped them live normal lives. A doctor used clear diagrams to show how neural implants worked. Many officers took notes and asked questions. Officer Ta watched everything carefully. He had spent the past week learning about Earth's elderly care system. The mayor had assigned him to work with the Golden Years Community Center. At first, the elderly members were unsure about him, but as days passed, they saw that he truly wanted to learn. The training program had 3 main parts. First, all officers would learn about medical technology. They needed to know the difference between legal devices and dangerous ones. Second, they would spend time with elderly citizens to understand their daily lives. Third, Earth-born officers would learn about Mars culture from their Mars-born colleagues. Captain Park Ji helped organize the training sessions. He worked with medical experts to create simple guides about common medical devices. These guides would help officers make better decisions during their daily work. "We want our officers to protect citizens, not frighten them," Captain Park told his team. "Understanding is the first step toward better protection." The program also included special training for Mars-born citizens who were new to Earth. Officer Ta helped design this part. He knew what it felt like to be confused by Earth's customs. Now he could help others avoid the mistakes he had made. In the afternoon, the mayor invited everyone to watch a demonstration. Mrs. Kim had agreed to show how her neural implant worked. She sat calmly while the doctor explained each part of the device. Officer Ta stood nearby, helping to answer questions from other Mars-born officers. "The device looks advanced because it needs to do an important job," Officer Ta explained to his colleagues. "But it is completely legal and necessary, just like the air filters we used on Mars." Many officers nodded at this comparison. They understood the importance of life-supporting technology. Now they could see that Earth's medical devices were similar to the tools they had used on Mars. As the first day of training ended, Mayor Kim felt satisfied. He watched as officers talked with elderly citizens, sharing stories and learning from each other. Even Officer Ta seemed more confident now. He was no longer just the officer who made a mistake. He was becoming part of the solution. The local news stations covered the program's launch. They showed footage of officers learning about medical devices and talking with elderly citizens. The angry protests from last week had turned into supportive gatherings. People brought food to share and stayed to watch the training. That evening, Mrs. Kim visited the community center. The elderly members greeted her warmly. They told her about the changes they had already noticed in the police officers' behavior. Officers were more patient now, and they asked questions instead of making assumptions. "Your son has turned a bad situation into something good," Mr. Choi told Mrs. Kim. She smiled, knowing that the city was taking its first steps toward real change. 1 month after the incident, Mrs. Sun Kim stood before a room full of police officers at the New Seoul Training Center. Her voice was steady as she began to tell her story. The room was completely quiet as she spoke about her life during the Great Migration of 2120. "I was 39 years old when the climate crisis forced many of us to leave our homes," she said. "We had to adapt to new places, new technologies, and new ways of living. It was not easy, but we learned to help each other." She touched her neural implant gently. "I lost my hearing during those difficult times. The air was bad, and many people had health problems. But Earth's medical technology gave us hope. These devices helped us live normal lives again." Officer Tai sat in the front row, listening carefully. He had been helping with the training program for the past month. Now, hearing Mrs. Kim's story, he understood why medical devices were so important to Earth's elderly citizens. Mrs. Kim continued her story. She told them about the challenges of learning to use the neural implant. She described how the device helped her stay connected with her family and friends. Her words helped the officers understand that these devices were not just pieces of technology. They were part of people's lives. After her talk, Mrs. Kim invited questions from the officers. Many hands went up. A young officer from Mars asked how she stayed so calm during the incident with Officer Ta. Mrs. Kim smiled. "When you have lived through hard times, you learn that anger solves nothing. Understanding and patience solve more problems than anger ever could." Officer Ta stood up next. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "Mrs. Kim, I want to apologize again for what I did. Thank you for helping us learn from my mistake." The room was silent, waiting for Mrs. Kim's response. She walked over to Officer Tai and patted his shoulder gently. "Young man, your willingness to learn and change is more important than any apology. You have shown that people can grow and improve." Later that afternoon, Mrs. Kim led a practical training session. She showed the officers different types of medical devices that elderly citizens commonly used. She explained how to identify legal devices and how to respectfully ask citizens about their medical technology. The training included real situations that officers might face. Mrs. Kim worked with each group, helping them understand the right way to handle these situations. Her patience and kindness made the learning process easier for everyone. During a break, Captain Park Ji thanked Mrs. Kim for her help. "Your story has changed how our officers think about their work," he said. "They are learning to protect citizens while showing respect for their needs." As the day ended, Mrs. Kim looked around the room. Officers from Earth and Mars were talking together, sharing experiences and learning from each other. Some were practicing how to check medical devices without causing fear or discomfort. Walking home that evening, Mrs. Kim felt satisfied. Her son had been right. Turning a bad experience into a teaching moment was better than punishment. She had helped build a bridge between the police and the community, between Earth and Mars, between the young and the old. At home, she found a message from Officer Ta. He had written to tell her that he was starting a support group for Mars-born officers. They would help each other understand Earth's culture and medical needs. Mrs. Kim smiled as she read the message. This was how real change happened, one person at a time, one lesson at a time. 3 months after the incident, Officer Lee Ta stood before a new group of police officers who had just arrived from Mars. The training room at New Seoul Police Headquarters was filled with curious faces. These officers were about to start their first week on Earth, just as he had done not long ago. "When I first came to Earth," Officer Ta began, "I made a serious mistake. I thought I knew everything about police work. But Earth taught me that being a good police officer means understanding the people we protect." He showed them pictures of different medical devices that Earth's citizens used. Each picture came with a story about the person who needed that device. Officer Ta had collected these stories during his time working with the elderly community. "These devices are not just technology," he explained. "They are parts of people's lives. They help grandparents hear their grandchildren laugh. They help elderly citizens stay independent. They are as important as the air filters we used on Mars." In the back of the room, Captain Park Ji watched with pride. Officer Ta had changed greatly in the past months. He was no longer the uncertain young officer who had made a mistake. Now he was helping others learn from his experience. After the morning session, Officer Todd took the new officers on a walk through the city. They visited the Golden Years Community Center, where elderly citizens helped them practice checking medical devices properly. The new officers learned how to be respectful while doing their jobs. Mr. Choi, the elderly man with the heart monitor, worked with one group of officers. "See how my device connects to my emergency alert system," he showed them. "This helps doctors know if I need help." Officer Ta learned all about these systems. Now he helps us explain them to others. During lunch, the new officers shared their thoughts. Many of them had worried about working on Earth. They had heard that Earth was very different from Mars. But Officer Ta's training helped them feel more confident. Earth and Mars are different, Officer Ta told them. But good police work is the same everywhere. We protect people by understanding them, not by frightening them. In the afternoon, Mrs. Kim visited the training session. She smiled when she saw Officer Ta teaching the new officers. He had become an important bridge between Earth and Mars, between the police and the community. "Officer Ta has shown us how to turn a mistake into wisdom," she told the group. "He reminds us that everyone can learn and grow if they are willing to try." Later that day, Officer Ta walked through his patrol area. People greeted him warmly now. Elderly citizens no longer looked worried when they saw him. Some even showed him their new medical devices, asking for his opinion about whether they had the right papers. At the end of his shift, Officer Ta visited the mayor's office to give his weekly report. Mayor Kim Han listened as the young officer described how the new training program was working. The mayor noticed that Officer Ta spoke with confidence now, but also with humility. "You have helped create something important," Mayor Kim told him. "Your experience has made our police force stronger and our city safer." Walking home that evening, Officer Ta thought about how much had changed. His mistake could have ended his career. Instead, it had given him a chance to make things better. He had learned that true strength came from understanding others, not from showing power. This lesson would stay with him for the rest of his career. 1 year had passed since the incident between Officer Ta and Mrs. Sun Kim. New Seoul megalopolis had changed in many positive ways during this time. The city had become a model for others across the United Earth Alliance in handling relations between Earthborn and Marsborn citizens. Mayor Kim Han sat in his office, reviewing the annual report on the Respect and Recognition Program. The statistics showed impressive results. Complaints about police treatment of elderly citizens had dropped by 90%. More importantly, positive interactions between police and citizens had increased significantly. The Golden Years Community Center had grown into an important training facility. Police academies from other cities sent their officers to learn from New Seoul's experience. Mrs. Kim's story had become a central part of their training materials. Her patience and wisdom in handling the incident taught valuable lessons about respect and understanding. Officer Lee Ta had received a promotion. He now led the Cultural Integration Unit, a new department that helped Marsborn citizens adjust to life on Earth. His own experience had made him perfect for this role. Under his guidance, new arrivals from Mars learned about Earth's customs and medical technologies before they started their jobs. Mrs. Kim continued to work with the police training program, but now she had help. Other elderly citizens had joined her as instructors. They shared their stories and helped officers understand the importance of medical devices in their lives. These personal connections made the training more meaningful for new officers. The mayor walked through the city streets, observing the changes. He saw police officers chatting respectfully with elderly citizens. He watched as officers carefully checked medical devices without causing fear or discomfort. The tension that had once existed between Earthborn and Marsborn residents had decreased significantly. At the police headquarters, Captain Park Ji had created a new handbook for officers. It contained clear guidelines about handling medical devices and working with elderly citizens. The handbook included pictures and stories from real situations. Other cities had started using copies of this handbook in their own police departments. One morning, A special ceremony took place at City Hall. The United Earth Alliance was recognizing New Seoul's achievements in improving police-community relations. Mrs. Kim and Officer Ta stood together on the stage as Mayor Kim accepted the award. After the ceremony, reporters asked Mrs. Kim how she felt about everything that had happened. She smiled and said, "Sometimes what looks like a problem can become a gift. Our city learned that understanding each other is more important than any rules or regulations." Officer Ta spoke next. "Mrs. Kim taught me that being a good police officer means being a good listener first," he said. "Now we teach all our officers this important lesson." The story of Mrs. Kim and Officer Ta had become more than just a lesson for police training. It showed how communities could grow stronger by learning from their mistakes. Schools began teaching this story to children, helping them understand the importance of respect and understanding between different groups of people. As the sun set over New Seoul megalopolis that evening, Mayor Kim Han looked out from his office window. He could see the busy streets below, where Earth-born and Mars-born citizens worked and lived together peacefully. His mother's wisdom and forgiveness had helped create this positive change. The incident that could have divided the city had instead brought it closer together. It had shown that true progress comes not from punishment, but from understanding and learning from each other. This would be the lasting legacy of the day when a simple mistake led to a city's transformation.